Late one autumn evening, the kind when the air feels damp and heavy, a woman named Kara stood at a bus stop on the edge of town. It was one of those lonely stops with a single flickering streetlight and an old wooden bench, splintered and worn. The bus was late, and Kara, clutching her coat tightly against the creeping cold, regretted not calling for a cab. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, shrouded in mist. Not a single car had passed in over 15 minutes, and the silence pressed against her ears like a weight. She glanced at her watch. Midnight was minutes away. As she shifted on the bench, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. A figure emerged from the mist, walking slowly down the road toward the bus stop. The figure was tall and thin, wearing a long coat that swayed slightly with each step. Something about the gait was off, like the person wasn't used to walking. Kara tried to tell herself it was nothing, but her grip on her bag tightened. The figure drew closer, stepping into the dim glow of the streetlight. His face was pale, almost waxen, and his eyes were sunken, as though he hadn't slept in weeks. He didn't look at her, but stood at the far end of the bench, his hands hanging limply at his sides. Kara forced herself to breathe evenly and stared down the road, willing the bus to appear. "Waiting for the 12:15?" the man asked suddenly. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried in the silence. "Yes," Kara replied, keeping her tone polite but distant. She avoided looking at him, focusing instead on the road. "It doesn't come anymore," he said. His tone was flat, devoid of emotion. Kara frowned and turned toward him. "What do you mean? I take this bus every week." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly turned his head to face her, his neck moving with a stiffness that made her stomach twist. "It hasn't come here for years," he said, his lips barely moving. Kara felt a shiver run down her spine. "You're mistaken," she said firmly, though her voice quavered. She reached for her phone to check the schedule, but the screen refused to turn on. "Come on," she muttered, pressing the power button repeatedly. "They won't work here," the man said. Kara froze, her fingers hovering over the unresponsive screen. "What do you mean, here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips curled into a thin smile, and he finally turned fully toward her. His eyes, now wide and glassy, seemed to reflect the flickering light in a way that made her feel nauseous. "You'll see," he murmured. Before Kara could respond, she heard it, the faint hum of an engine in the distance. Relief flooded her as headlights pierced through the fog. The bus was finally arriving. She stood quickly, clutching her bag as the vehicle pulled up. The doors hissed open, and Kara climbed aboard without a backward glance. The bus was empty, save for the driver, an older man with tired eyes. Kara slid into a seat near the front, eager to leave the strange man behind. But as the bus pulled away, she glanced out the window. The man was still standing under the streetlight, watching her with that unnerving smile. The bus ride was silent, the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the vehicle the only sounds. Kara tried to calm herself, staring out the window at the passing trees and fields, but something felt off. The route seemed unfamiliar, the turns sharper, the darkness outside thicker. She leaned toward the driver. "Excuse me," she said. "Are we on the right route?" The driver didn't answer. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, unblinking. Kara's heart began to race. She glanced at the other seats, wondering if she'd missed another passenger, but the bus was completely empty. Then she noticed something in the reflection of the window. A figure was standing in the aisle, just a few rows behind her. Slowly, she turned her head, and her blood ran cold. It was the man from the bus stop. How did you get on?" she stammered, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he began to move toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. Kara shot up from her seat and ran toward the front of the bus, pounding on the driver's partition. "Stop! The bus! Let me off!" she screamed. The driver didn't react. The man behind her was getting closer. She could feel the air grow colder with each step he took. Desperate, Kara grabbed the emergency stop lever and yanked it down. The bus screeched to a halt, throwing her forward. When she looked back, the man was gone. She scrambled to the door, forcing it open and tumbling out onto the deserted road. The bus disappeared into the fog, leaving her alone in the darkness. Kara stood there, trembling, trying to catch her breath. She looked around, realizing she was back at the bus stop, the same flickering streetlight, the same splintered bench. And there, standing under the light, was the man, his pale face split into an impossibly wide grin. This time he stepped closer, and the last thing Kara saw was his cold, glassy eyes before the light blinked out entirely. It was a bitterly cold night, and Luke regretted staying so late at work. His car had broken down earlier that week, so he was forced to take the bus home. The last stop before his house was at the edge of a forest, a dense, looming stretch of trees that seemed darker than the night itself. He hated walking through it, but it was the fastest way home. When Luke arrived at the bus stop, the area was eerily quiet. A faint wind whispered through the trees, and the single streetlight buzzed faintly, casting a dim, yellow glow. The bus was late, which wasn't unusual, but something about the night felt off. He glanced around, hoping to spot another passenger, but he was completely alone. After a few minutes, he heard footsteps. A woman in a long coat and scarf appeared from the shadows, walking toward the bench. She moved strangely, her head tilted slightly to one side, her steps deliberate but uneven. Luke nodded politely as she sat down a few feet away, but she didn't acknowledge him. She kept her face turned away, staring into the dark trees. Luke's unease grew. He tried to shake it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. He checked his phone for the time, but the screen wouldn't light up. He frowned and tried again. Dead battery. With a sigh, he slipped it back into his pocket. "Do you know what time it is?" he asked the woman. His voice sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. She didn't respond. She didn't even flinch, as though she hadn't heard him. Luke cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "Excuse me. You shouldn't be here," she interrupted, her voice sharp and hoarse, like the crackle of dead leaves. She still didn't look at him. Luke blinked, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" She finally turned her head, and Luke felt his stomach drop. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes black and bottomless, like twin voids. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "It comes for those who wait." Before Luke could ask what she meant, the sound of an engine roared in the distance. Headlights cut through the dark as the bus appeared, its large form rolling to a stop. Luke leapt to his feet, glancing back at the woman, but she was gone. The bench where she'd sat was empty. The doors of the bus opened with a hiss. Luke hesitated, suddenly unsure. But the chill in the air pushed him forward, and he climbed aboard. The driver was an older man, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. Without a word, Luke dropped his fare into the slot and moved to a seat near the middle. The bus was empty, except for him. The dim interior lights flickered as the bus began to move. Luke stared out the window, watching the forest blur past. The ride felt wrong, too long, the turns unfamiliar. He began to wonder if he'd gotten on the wrong bus. "Hey," he called out to the driver. "Where are we going?" The driver didn't respond. He sat rigid, his eyes locked on the road. Luke stood and walked toward the front of the bus. "Excuse me," he said louder. "Is this the route to?" The driver turned his head sharply, and Luke stumbled back in horror. The man's face was gone, just a smooth, featureless expanse of skin. The bus jerked violently, and Luke fell against the seats. When he looked up, the driver was facing forward again, his hands gripping the wheel. Panicked, Luke turned toward the back of the bus, and his heart stopped. The woman from the stop was sitting in the last row, staring straight at him with those black, empty eyes. She smiled, her teeth too sharp, too numerous, and began to rise. The lights flickered and went out entirely. The bus plunged into darkness, and Luke felt the air grow thick and suffocating. He fumbled for the emergency exit, but the doors wouldn't budge. He could hear her footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving closer. When the lights flickered back on, she was right in front of him. Her hands reached out, cold and bony, and her grin widened impossibly as she whispered, "You shouldn't have waited." The last thing Luke saw was her face, splitting open into a gaping void, swallowing the light, the bus, and his screams. The next morning, the bus stop was empty, save for a single shoe lying forgotten on the bench. The rain fell in heavy sheets as James huddled under the decrepit bus shelter on Old Creek Road. The wooden beams groaned under the weight of years and water, and the dim glow of a nearby streetlight barely pierced the darkness. The last bus of the night was running late, and James shifted uncomfortably on the damp bench. His phone was dead, leaving him with nothing but the rhythmic patter of rain and the occasional rustle of leaves to keep him company. Minutes ticked by, and James began to feel a strange unease creeping over him. It wasn't just the loneliness, it was something deeper, a sense that he was being watched. He glanced around, peering into the inky blackness of the road and the surrounding trees, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edge of his thoughts. Just as he convinced himself it was his imagination, a figure appeared in the distance. It was hard to make out through the rain, but it was moving toward him, slowly and deliberately. As the figure got closer, James could see it was a man wearing a long, dark coat. His hat obscured most of his face, but something about the way he moved set James on edge. His steps were too precise, too mechanical. The man reached the shelter and stepped under the roof without a word. He stood at the far end, just out of the light's reach, and didn't acknowledge James. Water dripped steadily from his coat, pooling at his feet. James gave a nervous nod and muttered, "Rough night, huh?" The man didn't respond. He didn't even seem to hear. Instead, he turned his head slightly, just enough for James to catch a glimpse of his face, or what should have been his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over sharp bones. His eyes were sunken, and his lips were thin, almost non-existent. James's breath hitched, and he quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to focus on the sound of the rain. But then the man spoke, his voice low and raspy like the creak of an old door. "Waiting for the bus?" James forced a shaky laugh. "Yeah. It's late, though." "It always is," the man replied. "But you should leave. It's not safe." James frowned. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, the faint light revealing more of his gaunt features. His eyes locked onto James, cold and empty. "They don't like visitors," he said. Before James could ask who they were, the sound of an engine cut through the storm. Headlights appeared down the road, and James let out a sigh of relief as the bus approached. The man stepped back into the shadows, melting into the darkness. The bus screeched to a halt, and the doors opened with a mechanical hiss. James climbed aboard, shaking off the rain. The driver didn't say a word, only giving him a quick nod as the doors closed behind him. The bus was nearly empty, with only a few passengers scattered throughout the dimly lit interior. James found a seat near the middle and settled in, glancing out the window as the bus pulled away. The road seemed different, the trees denser, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. James didn't recognize the route, but he told himself the rain was distorting his view. As the bus rumbled on, the uneasy feeling from the shelter returned, stronger this time. He looked around at the other passengers. They were unnervingly still, their heads bowed, faces obscured by shadows. One woman sat just a few rows ahead, her head tilted unnaturally to the side. James stared, his unease growing until she suddenly turned toward him. Her face was grotesque, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth stretched into a silent scream. James shot to his feet, heart racing. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the bus. The driver didn't respond, his face a blank mask. The other passengers began to move now, slowly turning their heads toward James, their faces all wrong, distorted, pale, and inhuman. Panic surged through him. He bolted toward the front of the bus, grabbing the driver's shoulder. "Stop the bus! Let me off!" he yelled. The driver finally turned to face him, and James staggered back. The man had no eyes, just empty sockets that oozed darkness. His mouth opened impossibly wide, emitting a low, guttural growl that filled the bus. James turned and ran toward the rear door, slamming his fists against it. "Open! Open! Damn it!" The lights on the bus flickered, and the world outside seemed to vanish into an endless void. The passengers began to rise, their twisted forms lurching toward him. Desperate, James grabbed the emergency exit lever and yanked it with all his strength. The door flew open, and he jumped into the darkness, hitting the ground hard. He scrambled to his feet, rain soaking him to the bone. When he looked up, the bus was gone. The road was gone. He was standing in the middle of the forest, the trees closing in around him. And then he heard it, a low whisper, growing louder, coming from all directions. "They don't like visitors." James turned, but there was no escape. Shadows moved among the trees, their pale faces emerging from the darkness, their eyes empty, their mouths opening in unison. The last thing James saw was their hands reaching for him, cold and unyielding, as the forest swallowed him whole. It was past midnight when Mia stepped off the bus at the edge of town. The air was cold, and the wind carried a strange metallic tang that set her teeth on edge. Her apartment was a 20-minute walk through a quiet residential neighborhood, but first she had to wait at a transfer bus stop, a lonely spot on a dimly lit stretch of road. The stop had one bench under a crooked shelter and a single flickering streetlight that seemed to make the darkness even deeper. She pulled her coat tighter and sat down, clutching her bag. The street was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. After a few minutes, Mia noticed something peculiar. Across the street, near the edge of a park, a man was standing perfectly still. He was barely visible in the shadows, but she could make out his outline, a tall figure with unnaturally long arms hanging by his sides. His head was tilted slightly, as though he were watching her. She tried to ignore him, telling herself he was probably just a drunk or a late-night wanderer. But as the minutes stretched on, he didn't move. He didn't shift or fidget, not even when the wind picked up. Her unease grew. She glanced at her phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. Dead battery. Typical. She cursed under her breath and looked back across the street. The man was gone. Mia's heart raced. She stood up, peering into the shadows, but there was no sign of him. She tried to convince herself he had just walked away, but the feeling of being watched remained. She scanned the street and the park, but saw nothing. The bus had to be close now. She sat back down, tapping her foot anxiously, her ears straining for the sound of an engine. A faint noise reached her, a rhythmic, crunching sound. Footsteps. They were coming from behind the bus stop. Mia froze. She didn't turn around, didn't move, but her mind raced. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, closing the distance between her and whatever was in the shadows. Her fingers tightened around her bag, her pulse pounding in her ears. The footsteps stopped. She could feel someone standing directly behind her. "Mia," a voice whispered. It was low and rasping, barely audible over the wind. Her blood turned to ice. She hadn't heard anyone approach, hadn't told anyone she'd be here tonight. Slowly, she turned her head, her breath hitching in her throat. No one was there. She shot to her feet, her eyes darting around the empty street. Her body was trembling, her knees weak, but she refused to stay there a second longer. She started walking toward the next stop, her footsteps hurried and uneven. The streetlights above her began to flicker as she moved. One by one, they dimmed and went out behind her, as though something was following, swallowing the light. The crunch of footsteps returned, louder now and closer. She broke into a run. The darkness pressed in around her, and her breaths came in panicked gasps. She didn't dare look back. Her only thought was to get away. The sound of footsteps suddenly stopped, replaced by something worse, a wet, guttural, dragging sound. It was coming from the shadows just ahead. Mia skidded to a halt, her breath catching as a figure emerged into the faint glow of a distant streetlight. It was the man from before, but now his features were clearer, and they were all wrong. His limbs were too long, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. His face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow pits where his eyes should have been. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, showing jagged, uneven teeth. "Why are you running?" he asked, his voice distorted, as though it came from somewhere deep beneath the earth. Mia took a step back, trembling. "Stay away from me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man didn't move. His grin widened and his head tilted further, bones audibly cracking. The dragging sound returned, and Mia realized it wasn't coming from him. It was coming from the darkness all around her. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows, twisted figures with elongated limbs and eyeless faces. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, closing in from all directions. Mia screamed and turned to run, but her path was blocked. The figures were everywhere, surrounding her. Their distorted grins and clawed hands reached for her as the lights above went out completely. The last thing she saw was the man stepping closer, his hollow eyes fixed on her. He leaned in, his cold breath brushing against her ear as he whispered, "You were never going to catch that bus." And then the world went black. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the pale glow of the moon. Clara sat at the bus stop alone, her breath fogging the air as she exhaled. It was an old stop, tucked away on a quiet stretch of road where the city lights barely reached. The wooden bench was splintered, and the glass panel behind her was cracked. It felt isolated, forgotten, just like tonight. The bus was running late, and Clara checked her watch. Midnight. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, trying to shake the cold, and the nagging sense of unease that had been building since she arrived. The street was deathly quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the nearby bushes. But then she heard it, faint footsteps echoing down the road. They were uneven, like someone dragging one foot behind them. She sat up straighter, peering into the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, walking slowly toward the bus stop. It was a man, tall and thin, with a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. His clothes were old-fashioned, a long, dark coat buttoned to the neck, the edges frayed and damp from the wet pavement. Clara felt her pulse quicken. The man didn't look threatening, but there was something about him that didn't feel right. She glanced away, pretending not to notice him as he approached. He stopped a few feet away and stood silently, facing the road. He didn't sit, didn't acknowledge her presence. Clara tried to focus on the street ahead, hoping the bus would arrive soon. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "Late night," the man said suddenly, his voice low and gravelly. Clara flinched, but forced a polite smile. "Yeah, the bus is running late." The man didn't respond. He turned his head slightly, just enough for Clara to catch a glimpse of his face. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes were sunken deep into their sockets. A shiver ran down her spine as she quickly looked away. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The man didn't move or speak again, but Clara could feel his gaze on her. She dared another glance at him and froze. He was staring at her now, his head tilted at an odd angle. His lips were curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Waiting for the last bus?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "It should be here soon." He chuckled softly, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "You know," he said, "not everyone who waits at this stop gets on the bus." Clara's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's smile widened, and he leaned in slightly. "Sometimes they get picked up by something else." Before Clara could respond, she heard the faint rumble of an engine. Headlights pierced through the fog as the bus came into view, its large frame rolling to a stop in front of the shelter. Relief flooded her as the doors hissed open. Without a second thought, Clara climbed aboard, dropping her fare into the slot. The driver, a stoic older man, barely glanced at her as she moved to a seat near the back. She looked out the window as the bus pulled away. The man in the hat was still standing at the stop, watching her. As the bus drove off, he raised a hand and waved. The ride was uneventful at first. Clara stared out the window, trying to calm herself. The bus rattled and creaked as it made its way through the quiet streets. But soon she noticed something strange. The route seemed unfamiliar. The buildings were gone, replaced by dense woods that shouldn't have been there. She leaned forward, calling out to the driver. "Excuse me, I think you missed a turn." The driver didn't respond. He sat motionless, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Sir?" she said again, louder this time. Still nothing. Clara stood and moved toward him, but before she could reach the front of the bus, the lights flickered and went out. The bus was plunged into darkness, and the engine's hum turned into a low, guttural growl. Panic set in. She stumbled back to her seat, gripping the edge tightly as the bus seemed to accelerate, hurtling through the night. The darkness outside was impenetrable, and the windows reflected only her pale, terrified face. Then she saw it. Movement in the reflection. Someone was walking down the aisle toward her. Her breath caught as she turned around. There, standing in the aisle, was the man in the hat. His face was twisted into an unnatural grin, his hollow eyes gleaming with something far worse than malice. "You shouldn't have gotten on," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. Clara screamed and backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The man's arms stretched impossibly long, his fingers curling like talons as he reached for her. The last thing she saw was his face, splitting open into a void of darkness, before the bus disappeared from the road entirely. The next morning, the bus stop stood empty, except for Clara's scarf lying in a crumpled heap on the bench. The bus was never found. But some nights, when the streets are quiet and the fog is thick, people swear they can hear the faint sound of wheels and the echo of a woman's scream fading into the night. The wind howled through the deserted streets as Ethan waited alone at the bus stop. It was late, nearly 1 a.m., and the city felt like a ghost town. The faint glow of a flickering streetlight barely illuminated the empty road, casting long, eerie shadows that danced with every gust of wind. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter around himself, checking his phone for the time. The bus was late. Typical. He sighed and leaned back against the bench, glancing up and down the street. Nothing but darkness stretched ahead with the faint silhouette of trees swaying in the breeze. Just as he was about to give up and call for a ride, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, echoing ominously in the still air. Ethan looked around, but the street was empty. The sound grew louder, closer, yet there was no one in sight. "Hello," Ethan called out, his voice breaking the silence. No response. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. Ethan stood, his heart pounding in his chest, and strained his ears for any sound. The wind seemed to die entirely, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. Suddenly, he saw it, a figure standing under the next streetlight, just barely visible through the gloom. It was tall and motionless, its features obscured by the shadows. Ethan squinted, trying to make out any detail, but the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. "Hey!" Ethan shouted, forcing confidence into his voice. "Do you need something?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, the streetlight above it flickered violently and then went out, plunging the figure into darkness. Ethan took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. When the light came back on, the figure was closer. It hadn't moved like a normal person. It was just there, closer than before. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Now he could see its outline more clearly. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its head tilted to the side as though it was studying him. A low, guttural sound broke the silence, like a growl mixed with static. Ethan stumbled back, his hand gripping the edge of the bench for support. The streetlight above him began to flicker, and he felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. The bus. He needed the bus to come now. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on frayed strings. Its head twitched with every step, the sound of cracking bones accompanying its motion. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off it, paralyzed by terror. Then, in the distance, he heard the rumble of an engine. Headlights appeared, cutting through the darkness as the bus came barreling down the road. Relief surged through Ethan as the vehicle screeched to a halt in front of the stop, its doors hissing open. Without hesitation, he leapt onto the bus, slamming his fare into the slot and rushing to a seat. He didn't even look at the driver. The doors closed with a thud, and the bus pulled away, leaving the eerie figure behind in the shadows. Ethan collapsed into his seat, his hands shaking. He glanced around, noticing how empty the bus was. No other passengers, just him and the driver, who sat rigid at the wheel, his face hidden under a cap. "Thanks for stopping," Ethan muttered, trying to steady his voice. The driver didn't reply. The bus trundled along the dark road, its interior lights flickering faintly. Ethan stared out the window, watching the shadows of the trees blur past. But then he noticed something odd. The route was wrong. They weren't heading into the city. In fact, they were moving deeper into the woods. "Hey," Ethan called out, standing up. "This isn't the way to downtown." The driver remained silent, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. Ethan walked to the front, his pulse quickening. "I said, this isn't." He stopped mid-sentence. The driver turned his head slowly, and Ethan's stomach dropped. The man's face wasn't human. His skin was waxy and pale, his eyes hollow pits of darkness, and his mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. Ethan stumbled back, tripping over a seat as the bus began to speed up. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the bus was filled with passengers. But these weren't ordinary people. Their faces were distorted, their bodies twisted into grotesque shapes. They all turned to look at Ethan, their hollow eyes locking onto him. The driver let out a low, inhuman laugh, and the bus veered sharply off the road, plunging into the dense forest. Ethan's screams were swallowed by the darkness as the twisted passengers closed in on him, their skeletal hands reaching out. The next morning, the bus stop on that lonely stretch of road was empty, save for Ethan's wallet lying on the bench. The bus was never seen again, but locals say that if you wait there after midnight, you can sometimes hear the faint sound of laughter and the rumble of an engine that never arrives. The night was unnervingly quiet as Lila sat at the bus stop at the edge of town. The only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. This stop was in the middle of nowhere, flanked on one side by a dense forest and on the other by an open field that stretched into the darkness. The bus was late, and her nerves were beginning to fray. Lila checked her phone. No service. She sighed and leaned back on the cold metal bench, glancing nervously toward the forest. Something about the trees unsettled her. The way their branches clawed at the sky reminded her of long, skeletal fingers. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and tried to focus on the road. But then she noticed something strange. The air had gone completely still. The wind had stopped, and so had the sounds of the night. No crickets, no rustling, no distant hum of traffic, just silence. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft she thought it might be her imagination. It was coming from the forest. Lila froze, straining to listen. The whisper grew louder, like a voice carried on the breeze, though there was no wind. Leela. Her heart skipped a beat. How did it know her name? She stood up, gripping her bag tightly, her eyes darting toward the trees. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whisper stopped. The silence returned, heavier this time, pressing down on her like a weight. She took a step back, her legs shaky, and glanced down the road, willing the bus to appear. Then she saw it, a figure standing just inside the tree line. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was tall and motionless, its silhouette blending with the shadows. "Hello," she called, though her instincts screamed at her to stay quiet. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. Lila's pulse raced. She took another step back, her eyes locked on the figure. If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. Suddenly, the streetlight above her flickered. When it came back on, the figure was closer, standing just outside the forest now. Its shape was clearer. A person, but distorted somehow. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Lila gasped and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bench. "Stay back!" she shouted. The light flickered again, and this time the figure was gone. Lila spun around, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She was completely alone, or so she thought. From behind her came a low, guttural noise, like a growl mixed with static. She turned slowly, her body trembling, and there it was. The figure was standing in the middle of the road now, illuminated by the flickering light. Its face, or what should have been its face, was blank, smooth, and featureless, but its head moved as if it were looking directly at her. Lila turned and ran. She didn't care where she was going as long as it was away from that thing. The sound of footsteps followed her, heavy and deliberate, keeping pace no matter how fast she ran. She didn't stop until she reached the next intersection, where a faint glimmer of headlights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over her as she saw the bus approaching, its engine rumbling louder with each second. She waved frantically, tears streaming down her face. The bus screeched to a halt and the doors hissed open. She stumbled inside, gasping for air, and collapsed into a seat near the front. "Drive, please, just drive," she begged the driver. The man didn't say a word. He simply nodded and pulled away, the bus groaning as it picked up speed. Lila leaned back in her seat, her entire body trembling. She glanced out the window, half expecting to see the figure following her, but the road was empty. For the first time that night, she felt a shred of safety. But then she noticed something odd. The other passengers on the bus weren't moving. They sat perfectly still, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their faces obscured by shadows. "Hello?" Lila called out, her voice shaking. No one responded. She leaned forward, trying to get a better look, and froze. The nearest passenger turned their heads slowly toward her. Their face was pale, featureless, like a blank mask, and their head twitched with jerky, unnatural movements. Lila screamed and bolted for the front of the bus. "Let me off," she yelled at the driver. He turned to look at her, and her stomach dropped. His face was just like the others, smooth, blank, and wrong. The bus lights flickered, and the world outside the windows began to warp. The road disappeared, replaced by an endless void of darkness. The passengers began to move, their heads snapping toward her in unison, their bodies twisting unnaturally as they rose from their seats. The last thing Lila saw was their blank faces closing in on her, their hands stretching out before everything went black. The next morning, a passing car found her bag on the side of the road, but there was no sign of Leela or the bus. Some say she got on the wrong ride that night, a ride that doesn't return from where it goes. And if you're ever waiting alone at that stop, you might hear the faint sound of footsteps and the whisper of your own name. It was a cold, foggy night, and the air felt heavy as Sarah waited at the old bus stop on Pine Hollow Road. The stop was infamous in her small town. People whispered about strange occurrences there, disappearing buses, passengers who never returned. But Sarah didn't believe in ghost stories, and she was too tired after her late shift to care about rumors. The bus was due at midnight, and her phone showed 11:55 p.m. She leaned back on the wooden bench, the paint peeling under her hand, and stared at the faint glow of the street lamp above. The fog swirled in eerie patterns, thickening by the minute, muffling even the distant sound of crickets. At 11:58, Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It was subtle at first, like the sensation of being watched. She scanned the area, nothing but fog and the faint outline of the road. Shaking her head, she muttered, "You're just tired," and looked back at her phone. Then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the direction of the road. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed in the stillness, sending a chill down her spine. She squinted into the fog, but she couldn't see anything. "Hello?" she called out hesitantly. The tapping stopped. Silence fell over the bus stop like a shroud. Sarah's chest tightened as she gripped her bag, suddenly feeling very exposed. The lamp above flickered, casting erratic shadows across the ground. At exactly midnight, she heard the familiar rumble of a bus engine. Relief washed over her as headlights pierced through the fog. The vehicle slowed and stopped in front of her, its doors hissing open. She climbed aboard, nodding at the driver, who was wearing a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. "Late night," he said in a gravelly voice. "Yeah," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. She dropped her fare into the slot and made her way to the back of the bus, which was eerily empty. The seats were old, the upholstery torn in places, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. The doors closed with a groan, and the bus began moving. Sarah stared out the window, watching the fog thicken outside. The road was barely visible, and the street lights disappeared one by one as they drove deeper into the mist. Minutes passed, and Sarah began to notice something odd. The route didn't look familiar. The bus wasn't heading toward her neighborhood. She stood and walked to the front. "Excuse me," she said to the driver. "I think you missed a turn." The driver didn't respond. His hands were tightly gripping the wheel, his face still hidden under the shadow of his hat. "Sir?" She tried again, her voice louder. He finally turned his head toward her, and Sarah's stomach dropped. His face was pale and waxy, like a mannequin. His eyes were solid black, gleaming like polished onyx. His grin stretched unnaturally wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "We're almost there," he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally in the enclosed space. Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding. She turned to the other seats, hoping to see another passenger, but they were no longer empty. Figures now occupied every seat, motionless, shrouded in shadow, their heads all tilted at odd angles. She backed away, her breaths coming in ragged gasps, and reached for the emergency exit handle at the back. The figures began to turn toward her, their movements stiff and jerky. Their faces were blank, featureless voids, and their limbs stretched unnaturally as they started to rise. Sarah yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were pitch black, no longer showing the outside world. The bus's interior lights flickered, and a low, guttural hum filled the air, growing louder and louder. The driver's laughter rang out, guttural and chilling. "You shouldn't have gotten on," he said. "This ride doesn't stop for anyone." The bus lurched, throwing Sarah to the ground. The floor beneath her felt strange, no longer metal but cold, damp earth. When she looked up, the bus was gone. She was lying in the middle of a dense forest, surrounded by twisted trees that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. A whisper echoed through the darkness, "You can't leave." Sarah scrambled to her feet, but no matter which direction she ran, she found herself back at the same spot. A clearing with the faint outline of the bus stop bench in the middle. The fog closed in tighter, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping and incoherent. The next morning, the bus stop on Pine Hollow Road was found abandoned, Sarah's phone lying shattered on the bench. Locals say they still see a bus there some nights, its headlights cutting through the fog, but it never stops for anyone. Those who dare to approach swear they hear whispers calling their names, and some claim they've seen a figure staring out from the back window, her face frozen in silent terror. The night was thick with mist as Jordan waited at the bus stop on the outskirts of town. The stop was old, forgotten by most, with cracked concrete and a leaning sign that barely held on to its faded paint. The only light came from a single dim street lamp overhead, its weak glow swallowed by the surrounding darkness. It was past midnight, and the bus was late, typical for this route. Jordan tapped his foot, the sound muffled against the damp pavement. His phone had died hours ago, leaving him with nothing to do but listen to the silence. That's when he noticed something strange. The world had gone still. The faint hum of distant traffic, the chirp of crickets, even the rustle of leaves, all gone. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. Jordan glanced around, suddenly uneasy. A sound broke the quiet, a faint shuffle, like someone dragging their feet across the pavement. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the shadows. At first, he saw nothing, but then just beyond the reach of the street lamp's light, he spotted movement. A figure was walking toward him, slowly, deliberately. Its outline was blurry in the mist, but it looked wrong. Too tall, its limbs too long. The closer it got, the more the unease in Jordan's chest grew. "Hey!" he called out, his voice wavering. "You waiting for the bus too?" The figure didn't respond. It stopped just at the edge of the light, and for a moment, Jordan thought it was staring at him. But its face, if it had one, was obscured by shadows. Jordan swallowed hard and stepped back, his foot catching on the edge of the bench. The figure moved again, stepping closer. This time it came fully into the light. Its face was hollow, like a mask of skin stretched over nothing. Its eyes were sunken pits, impossibly deep, and its mouth was a gash that curved too wide as if carved into its head. It didn't smile, but the shape of its face suggested it wanted to. Jordan's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He could only watch as the figure raised a long, bony hand and pointed down the road. A low rumble echoed through the mist. The bus. Its headlights cut through the fog, growing brighter as it approached. Relief surged through Jordan's chest. Whatever this thing was, it couldn't hurt him if he got on the bus. The vehicle came to a screeching halt in front of the stop, its doors hissing open. Without a second thought, Jordan jumped aboard. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, didn't even glance at him as he dropped his fare into the slot and hurried to a seat near the back. The doors closed, and the bus lurched forward, leaving the figure behind in the mist. Jordan exhaled shakily, his heart still racing. He stared out the window, watching the darkened streets blur past. But something felt off. The bus was too quiet. The usual hum of the engine was faint, almost non-existent. He glanced at the other passengers and froze. They were all sitting perfectly still. Not one of them moved or even shifted in their seats. Their faces were obscured, turned away from him, but something about their postures felt unnatural, rigid, like mannequins. Jordan's unease deepened. He leaned forward to get a better look at the nearest passenger, a woman with long hair spilling over her shoulders. "Hey," he whispered. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. He hesitated, then reached out to tap her shoulder. The moment his fingers brushed against her, her head snapped toward him. Her face was featureless. Smooth skin stretched over a blank surface where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. And yet, somehow, she was looking at him. Jordan jerked back, his breath catching in his throat. One by one, the other passengers turned toward him. Their faces were the same, empty, blank, and utterly wrong. The bus's interior lights flickered, and a low, unnatural hum filled the air. He scrambled out of his seat, stumbling toward the driver. "Stop the bus! Let me off!" he shouted. The driver didn't react. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Jordan reached out to shake him, but the moment he touched the driver's shoulder, the man's head turned. Slowly. Too slowly. The driver's face was a void, a swirling darkness that seemed to pull Jordan in, his vision blurring as the void consumed his mind. A voice, low, guttural, and echoing, spoke in his head. "You shouldn't have boarded." The bus shuddered violently, and the lights went out. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. When Jordan opened his eyes, he was sitting alone on the bench at the bus stop, his hands trembling. The fog was gone, replaced by the faint light of dawn. But the bus never came, and the road was empty. When Jordan tried to stand, his legs gave out beneath him. That's when he noticed his reflection in the shattered glass of the stop's shelter. His face was gone.